Okay, well, this is kind of a fun presentation that relates hockey to the Green Bay Packers. It actually is, there's a brief article that I wrote last year that appeared in the bulletin, but you may have forgotten about it. Well, I stayed the Holiday Inn last night, but also I've added some photos to it to kind of enrich the story. So that's where we're going to tell you the story today, how two hockey players got the Green Bay Packers kicked out of their first professional hockey league. So that's what we're going to kind of maybe the last presentation of the day. So
No, we got Ben live.
okay.
Ben Live again?
So I really have to start the story with a photo of the 1918 Notre Dame football team. Now that football team included Curly Lambeau, who became famous with the Packers. Has anybody been to a Packer game? Lambeau Field is what the Packer Stadium is called that. The other person is Newt Rockne, the coach. Okay, we're starting to get a few people we know. Then there's George Gipp right in here. And you're going to hear about two hockey players, this fella here and this fella here. This name is Hulk Henderson and O.J. Larson. There were a couple of players we're going to hear about later in the presentation. This was Newt Rockne's first year as the Notre Dame coach. This Hunk Anderson and O.J. really Gipp, Larson, and Anderson were all from the Calumet area. And we showed you this morning where Calumet is. George Gipp was recruited there on a baseball scholarship or to play baseball. And Newt Rockne discovered him out kicking a ball. He never played football, but he found him in the spring kicking a ball around campus. So he said, well, come on, be the kicker for the Notre Dame team. We'll find out he became a little more famous later. Well, Gipp suggested to Newt Rockne, I got two guys back in Calumet that are pretty good football players. So these two guys got recruited to Notre Dame to play football. Now, next slide, please. Curly Lambeau only was there for 1 year. He's from the Green Bay area, so he returned home to Green Bay and organized a football team, an amateur football team. So here is Lambeau in the middle. He was kind of the player coach, and this is the guy that had the money. And they had the Indian packing company sponsor the team, so they were called the Packers. Next slide, please. Well, 2 years later, another company bought the Packers, the Acme Packing Company. So the Green Bay Packers, the Acme Packers. So you'll see on their jerseys, Acme Packers. And this was their first season in the American Professional Football Association. Okay? And this is really the first professional football league. Next slide. So the American Professional Football League started in 1920. It had 14 teams in the league, primarily in the Midwest. Their first president was a fellow named Jim Thorpe. Remember that name? Okay. Well, he was kind of a player coach of one of the teams. The second season, 1921, this is the fellow that was elected to be the president of the American Professional Football Association. And what he did was wrote a constitution for the league. They put bylaws, they put a number of rules to operate the league. Now, in 1921, there were 21 teams in the league. Now, several teams folded during the season, and the Chicago Steelers were the champions of that year. Now, after the season, the Packers were suspended. This was their first season. They were suspended. You probably wonder, well, how come? Next slide, please. The Packers were caught using the college players who had some remaining eligibility, happened to be at Notre Dame. These are the three players that were caught. They were under an assumed name. One of the games late in the season, these guys, Curly Lambeau knew about them because he played with them at Notre Dame. So these are the three that were, and remember I pointed out two of them to start with, O.J. Larson and Hunk Anderson. And then the third, Hector Garvey, with the three of them. Now, Joe Carr had wrote in the bylaws that you were not supposed to use college players that still had some eligibility. So Curly Lambeau kind of slipped them in and they got caught. Now, some suggest that it was George Halas from the Chicago Bears who kind of let the word out. Well, how did George Halas know about it? His brother was an assistant coach at Notre Dame in 1921. So next slide, please. Well, the league was renamed in June of 1922. It became the National Football League. Joe Carr was again reelected the president. It actually was the president for the next 18 years. Now, Curly Lambeau, they were suspended at the end of the season, 1921. So they were basically kicked out of the league. But Curly Lambeau pleaded to the league, let us back in, we won't do it again. And so they were reinstalled for this 1922 season. There were 18 teams in the first NFL season. Next slide. These are the 18 teams. The Green Bay Packers are one of those teams, but there's a couple of teams here, the Hammond Pros and the Orang Indians. They were traveling teams. They never had a home field. They were traveling teams. Jim Thorpe was the coach and best player for the Indians. They were all Native American players. But these are some of the teams on here. George Halas had converted the name from the Staleys to the Bears. And they're still operating today as the Bears. And George Halas was with that team forever as owner and everything. So probably don't recognize many of these teams. That is the first teams in the National Football League. Okay, next slide, please. Well, I gotta go back a year or two because you start waiting, where are the hockey players in here? This is the 1920 Notre Dame football team. Now, again, we've got a few in the team here. There's Newt Rockney here's the coach again. And then we start to look at other people in here. There's still in there is George Gipp. The three players I mentioned before are tucked in the photo here. Anderson, Larson, and that Hector Garvey are in the photos. Rather than pick them out, you won't remember them anyways. Okay, so this team won the national championship in 1920. Undefeated at 9-0. Next slide. George Gipp was the All-American, an All-American halfback that year for the team. Photo of Gipp running the ball. Now, if you look back on history, George Gipp died at the end of the season. So he was kind of, if there was such a thing as a Heisman Trophy, George Gipp would have won the Heisman Trophy that year. So he was the outstanding running back at the time. But he died at the end of the season. Now, George Gipp rarely went to class. He was kicked off the team usually at the end of every football team, and alumni would put him back on the team. So he still never went to classes. He spent most of his time playing poker and gambling and chasing women in Chicago. So quite a, if you read his story. Now, next slide, please. Here's a photo of George Gipp, who said, there's lots written about him. He died in December 1920. And the person on the right is Newt Rockne. 1920 was his third season with Notre Dame football. So there's a lot written about these two individuals. Next slide, please. Well, recognize this guy? Ronald Reagan played George Gipp in a movie in the 1940s. And this was the name of the movie. Remember the famous line from the movie? Win one for the Gipper. So this is the story of that one. So kind of an interesting element to it. Now we have to get to the hockey story. This is the 1920-1921 Notre Dame hockey team. It was really their first season in which they played another college team. Now, in this photo there is Hunk Anderson. He was the goalie. And then the other hockey player in here is O.J. Larson. Now, the player coach of the team was a fellow named Pat Kastner, this fellow right here. He was from St. Paul, Minnesota. There was a third player in there from Calumet. It was Wilcox, who's this fellow over here. So they actually had the three on the 1920 team. They had the three people from Calumet plus George Gipp. 4 players from Calumet played on the team, or 3 of them played on the hockey team. Now, Wilcox was kind of the almost like a freshman. So he didn't play. He was not one of the unnamed players. But Anderson and Larson were the unnamed players that played for the Green Bay Packers. Now, that team only played 3 games that year. Next slide, please. But they actually did play in Calumet, Michigan, in Michigan Tech's first varsity team. They played them one night in the Amphitheatre. I showed you that photo this morning on a Thursday night. And the Michigan College of Mines, now it's Michigan Tech, beat Notre Dame in their first game as a varsity college team for both teams. Michigan Tech had played Michigan the week before, but this is Notre Dame's first game as a college team, college hockey team. The next night they played in the Coliseum in Calumet because they had three players from Calumet on the team. So next slide, please. This is the Calumet Coliseum where they played. It opened in December 1913. It is, Mrs. Boudreau talked about old hockey arenas. This is probably the oldest continually operated hockey arena in the world. There's been hockey in this arena every year since 1913. One of the Boston Matthews, they shut down for a couple of years. There's been hockey in this location every year since 1913. So that's where the game was. Let's say the Michigan College of Mines won the Thursday night game. Notre Dame won the Saturday night game in Calumet. Next slide, please. Calumet was the Kraft Hockeyville in 2019, and the game was, and with Hockeyville, there's a game. So the game was between the St. Louis Blues, they were the Stanley Cup winner, and the Detroit Red Wings. That was the game there. And so naturally it's an exciting time in Calumet. Calumet now is a small community of about 2,000 people. I talked this morning about the Copper Country. Houghton County, where Calumet is, had 100,000 there at the turn of the century. It now has about 35,000. Calumet at the time had a population of 25 to 30,000. Now its population is less than 3,000 or 4,000, metropolitan Calumet. So it's the copper mine. Okay, next slide. So this is the 1921 Notre Dame football team. So this is before the football season in 1921. So tucked in this photos are Anderson, Larson, and Wilcox, Kastner, and Garvey. They're all tucked in that photo. Remember, this is their football season. At the end of the season, 3 of them ended up playing as unknown players for the Packers. Okay, now when the Notre Dame found out that these were players that had played unnamed for the Packers, they were ineligible. So they could not play for the hockey team in 1921-22. So next slide. This is the 1921-1922 Notre Dame hockey team. Hunk Anderson is not there, and O.J. Larson is not there because the athletic board at Notre Dame basically kicked them off all the athletic teams. Hunk Anderson was to be the captain of this particular team, but he lost the job. Now, this is Kastner again, the fellow from St. Paul. He ended up to be the rover on the team, and in this year they played 9 games. They went 8-1 that year. Kastner scored as the rover. He scored 37 out of the 55 goals that the team had scored that year. So he was the player. Now, he also was an outstanding baseball player. He was captain of the baseball team. He played football, and he also was a member of the hockey team, kind of the player coach of the hockey team. Pretty versatile athlete. Now, they did play Michigan College of Mines again and beat them twice in the 1922 season. Now, I point out the goalie here, the fellow who replaced Hunk Anderson, was his name was Jim Crowley. And if anybody knows, probably nobody in here knows about Notre Dame football, but he was a halfback and he was a member of the famous 4 horsemen of the Notre Dame football team in the 1920s. He only played 1 season as goalie and then was replaced. Okay, next slide. 1922 Chicago Bears. Well, this is the head coach was George Hallis, and on this particular team, in the photo here is Anderson, Larson, and Garvey. All played for the Bears in 1922. Remember I said about the story about, well, maybe George Hallis had something to do with this. Well, he signed them to play pro football. Anderson played 5 seasons in the National Football League in the 1920s, and then he started coaching. He was the head coach at North Carolina State, at St. Louis, and he was actually the head coach of the Chicago Bears in the 1940s. He was the head coach when they won the championship in 1943. He also was the head coach at Notre Dame. When Newt Rockne was killed in a plane crash in 1931, Anderson was an assistant coach. He took over the job of head coach, and he was the head coach for 3 seasons in there. Larson ended up playing 6 seasons in the NFL, and Garvey played 9 seasons with several teams in the National Football League. Next slide. So there's the story of 2 hockey players and how they got the Green Bay Packers kicked out of pro football. There you are. Questions? Any questions? Yes.
I've been looking for college information for a long time. Is it hard? How hard is it to find information on the college hockey from the 20s generally relative here in Canada, but in the US, how easy or hard is it to find team rosters and?
It's actually not too, it's actually not too hard.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to dig into some of the newspaper articles, like newspapers.com, and kind of put things together, but you can actually find photos and of different teams. That's where I found these photos, digging around. You can actually find statistics on different teams. Often you have to having to go to like Notre Dame website, or there's several of these programs have books written on them, and you can yearbooks or different things. So I've done a lot of work on Michigan Tech work, and you really get into student newspapers, local newspapers, the yearbooks, all kind of way to kind of piece together stats and stuff for them.
So I know when towns get like a hockey bill, they usually have the subjects language.
That was the Coliseum. So just like they do in Canada, a team gets a grant of money to renovate the stadium. So what they did in the Coliseum was they put in elevators to make them handicapped accessible. There's kind of a second floor lookout. They updated their ice plant. They made a few other changes in the arena itself, but they spent, I think it was about $300,000 or $400,000. But it was a hard ticket to get. You can imagine. So what they did was they gave free tickets to children and their parents of junior hockey, minor hockey, youth hockey in Calumet. I was fortunate. I was there at the right time. They asked me to do an interview between the periods of Hockeyville. And I said, well, I don't have a ticket to the game. And the NBC said, we'll get you in the game. So I never got a seat, but they told me, you stand behind Liam and at that time, Jeremy Roanoke, you stand beside them. Yeah, as they said, don't touch that plug because it'll wipe out everything. But we stood beside them for the game. So my wife and I got to see the Hockeyville game, but it's just Hockeyville, if anybody's been involved in it, it's just an amazing thing for these small communities. They come in for several days with the Stanley Cup, and in that area, it was a big thing. It was a big thing. It just, the whole community just comes alive. And the NHL just does a super job.
Who's the major sponsor? Is it?
It's Kraft. Kraft is the major sponsor there too. So it's a great event.
Might have role in this scandal. Do you think there's a living with this stadium named after him? Should someone lead an effort to have a stadium named?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the question or the comment.
Why the role that Lambo's played in the scandal? Does he deserve having this?
Yes, he does. Yeah, he basically was the first owner, the player, the coach. The interesting thing with the Packers in 1922, the Packers were in grave financial condition. And so Lambeau and one or two others in the community said, we're going to lose this team. So let's let the community buy into the football team. And so now it is the only NFL franchise that's owned by the community or shareholders. So I actually own one share of the Green Bay Packers. Had to buy it a few years ago for $300 or $400. But I get this, I've got this stock certificate. It's worth nothing, but it's framed. I bought one for my two sons, so they're shareholders. I think there's 300 to 400,000 shareholders or shares, but hey, they're part owners. I get invitations to the shareholder meeting. What is unique is my wife kids me, well, I asked her, would you like a share too? No, I don't want to share, but if I die, she gets the share. I can't sell it anywhere, but she gets the share. So it's kind of but what the Packers have done, they've had a few stock offerings every few years. And their latest one that they had, I think, was about 3 or 4 years ago. That's when I bought it. They collected $100 million or something. And then they added seats on. And really, if you start to look at the Packers, has anybody been to a Packer game? It is one of the ultimate NFL experiences to go to a Packer game. Getting season tickets, if you went in today to buy season tickets, it is virtually impossible. A few years ago, I came across, they said, someone said, get your name on the season ticket holders. And they said, the list is fairly long. And I said, I may not still be alive. So I brought a getting on the list for my son. At that time, he was about 10 or 11. At that time, he was and he gets a card every year. He was about 80,000 on the list to get season tickets. Now the stadium added some seats, and now he's down to about 25,000 on the list. So it's going to be a few years before he can actually get season tickets to the Packers. They are passed from family to family. But you can still, if you wanted to get a Packer game, you're probably going to get one in the market someplace. You can get it. So
The waiting list is 30 years for a season ticket to Green Bay.
yes,
Think about the same amount of time for Kirkland Lake too, right?
We don't have cheesecake.
None.
so it is an interesting experience. The Packer game is the ultimate. And when you look at ratings, it is among the #1 experience for NFL game. We probably get into debate what's the #1 fan experience for an NHL arena. Probably in this group, we probably get into debate. I know some are going to say the TD Garden, and some are going to say the Forum. Some may even say the Toronto Maple Leafs. So, okay, fair. Okay, thank you. Good question.